This is an interview with Circuit Judge Richard Clifton. Welcome, Judge. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to sort of have this conversation and learn about your pre-legal history and some of the things that you've done as a judge. So maybe we could start out and talk about your decision to become a lawyer and your influences in your early youth.
I'm really not sure why I decided to become a lawyer, but I remember writing, can't call it an essay because it was like 6th grade, maybe a paragraph, what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I wrote about being a lawyer, and it was the first time I'd written about something other than being a fireman, or in those days an astronaut. And I'm not sure why, because there were no lawyers in the family, and at that point I didn't know any lawyers. Lawyers for me were TV characters like Perry Mason, which isn't a lot like being a lawyer, as it turns out. I've never ever had somebody jump up in the back of the courtroom and expound that he was guilty and Perry's client is innocent, but I liked lawyer TV shows, and I liked the idea of rules when you play pickup basketball and football and baseball with friends, and I was the person who they turned to if they needed a rule because I just had an interest. And remember, I had a book when I was a kid about So You Think You Know Baseball, and it had details about rules, and I just had a good time reading that. So becoming a lawyer was a possibility identified early on, and nothing better ever came along. So I went from high school to college to law school.
And you probably are well familiar then with Robert's Rules of Order.
I am, and spent my years doing parliamentary procedure type stuff.
Is that right?
But I confess I haven't looked at that book in 20 years now, so we can leave it that way.
Well, I do too, but they now have a little cheat sheet book that's
that helps.
thin. Yes.
That helps. Well, I did high school debate, and they had these student congress things, and you learn about Robert's Rules of Order for part of that. And yeah, it was important at that time to figure out a motion to table and a motion to adjourn and who has priority and so forth. You need rules to have orderly conduct of business.
Yeah, so. Difference between a motion to adjourn to time certain and
I need my chart today to tell you what that is, but there's a difference.
That's right. So as you went through college and law school, you went to East Coast colleges, I recall.
I went to Princeton undergraduate and Yale Law School.
And did you experience anything in college that made you further your legal career?
In some ways. I mean, I was can't call it a major exactly, but at Princeton you divide into departments. One department was the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs, which has lots of, at that time, budding lawyers. One of my classmates in that department and at Princeton and at Yale was Justice Alito. And there were several of us who went from my class at Princeton to Yale Law School together, and all of us were in the Wilson School as a department at Princeton. So it's where a lot of us came from, and I took classes at Princeton in constitutional government, and not intense legal classes, but legal concepts. And I was interested by it. I wrote one of the long writing assignments you have during junior year, called the junior paper, was on constitutional law. A lot of comparative law with provisions in the U.S. Constitution as compared to provisions in the Japan Constitution. Was largely written by the occupation forces after World War II. The constitutions of Ireland and some other nations we studied, and it was a fascinating project. And so I became that much more interested in going to law school.
That's really interesting. It sounds very intense and also broad scope at the same time.
It was. We'd look at, or in my paper, looked at certain provisions, and I couldn't tell you today what they were, but I could imagine there would have been First Amendment and so forth, and see what, if any, equivalents there were in the constitutions of other nations. And some of it had to do with structure of government. Obviously, a parliamentary government is different from our structure. But if you dig down deep enough, you find some common principles.
Well, that's interesting because, in my experience, at least in the intellectual property area, some of the judges are starting to look at laws in the last maybe 5 years from other countries, and there's a big debate. Is that that experience you had may be relevant even today?
It could be. I mean, occasionally, and it became a big debate in more generally constitutional law, and Justice Scalia was outspoken against the reliance upon citations on constitutional concepts. Certainly capital punishment cases featured those. There are other opinions by justices that look to the laws and constitutional standards of other nations as guides. Justice Scalia firmly rejected that, saying they have nothing to do with our Constitution of 1789. The kind of cases I'm working on rarely has become an issue unless specifically, I mean, I've had cases involving the application of English law, and so you look to English law. But there's an underlying interest. A few months ago, my family took a trip to England, and we went to the Supreme Court of England. And of course, it's a much newer institution, but it was interesting to consider the procedures they follow versus the procedures that we follow. Our legal system is an Anglo-American system of law, but over 200 plus years, the systems have diverged, but also find things to lean upon from the other. So I like that comparison. I like the comparison more immediately. I'm on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. There are other regional circuits, and I've got law school classmates and other friends who sit on other circuits, and it's fun sometimes to compare notes, because we're all doing the same thing, but we do it in slightly different ways. And you learn something from looking at how other people do things. One of the things that I expect to do when I take senior status, which I will be doing at the end of the year, at some point in time I'll take up the opportunity to sit with other circuits, for example, just to find out how they do what we do. And we have lots of visiting judges from other circuits who sit with us on the Ninth Circuit, and I talk with them about what they do and how they go about doing the same thing. You can learn from other people's experiences.
And when these are procedural versus...
These are procedural.
Yeah.
I mean, there are circuit splits and conflicts,
Right.
but those we don't talk about so much. That's just the stuff of what we do in making decisions. But how you go about making decisions, maybe my interest in rules goes back to that level. The process part,
Yes.
and how different people, different processes evolve in different courts. And sometimes you can learn from how other people do things that maybe there's a system that we ought to consider.
And sometimes it has to do with maybe the size or geography, or I know that they do things different in Idaho than they do in Central District.
And we learn a lot. I mean, the Ninth Circuit, because it's so large, because the judges are spread out, we organize oral arguments differently than they do in the D.C. Circuit, where everybody's in the same building. I mean, there's some differences that are explained by circumstances, and there are some that are just explained because different groups have followed their patterns and treat different kinds of cases differently. But in the end, we're all doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, let's go on to your law school. And you went to Yale.
I did.
And anything particular you want to talk about your Yale experience?
I didn't think I liked law school very much. In retrospect, I realized that it wasn't that I didn't like law school so much as that I was sort of tired of being in school. I followed what was then a much more common pattern than it is today of going grade school to high school to college to law school, nothing in between. Yeah. And I'm real happy with the way things worked out, and I know that if I diverged along the way, my life would have taken an entirely different path, but it probably would have been good for me. I think I would have gotten more out of law school if I had done something else for a time. But I enjoyed the friends that I made there. Yale is a great law school, and I discovered my resistance to being in school the following year when I became a law clerk to Judge Herbert Choi, the first Ninth Circuit judge from Hawaii. And being a Court of Appeals judge or a law clerk to a Court of Appeals judge is really like an intense form of law school. I mean, if you think about what we do, We read briefs, we read precedents and statutes and regulations and come up writing appellate opinions, and that's the stuff of law school. But because there were real people attached to these cases, they weren't simply hypothetical. And not that we ever saw the real people. I mean, the Court of Appeals really doesn't. And I was a law clerk for a judge in Honolulu, so it's not like I was, in those days, the law clerks didn't customarily travel with the judges so much. So I never saw any party in any of the cases. But because I knew there were real parties there that cared about the case, and this wasn't a hypothetical academic exercise, it was much more engaging for me. And that's when I had confirmed, I guess, that the law was something I had an inherent interest in. It wasn't just something to do because I didn't want to do something else. I mean, I didn't like the sight of blood, so I couldn't be an MD, right? So I had to find something. But no, I confirmed the interest that I thought I had in being a lawyer from a long time before.
Well, I want to come back to that, but how did this law clerk come about? Did you just...
So I'm sitting in the East Coast, and I mostly grew up in the Midwest. I mean, my father worked for an insurance company, so he moved around when I was a kid. So I was born in Framingham, Massachusetts, but had no family there. And before I turned 4, we moved to Indianapolis. And when I was 10, moved to the Chicago area where my brother continues to live, and my parents lived until they passed away. And so I viewed myself as being from Chicago or from the Midwest. Went off to the East Coast for college. I worked on a research project in the South, and my family had once taken a trip through this part of the South. But I'd never been in the West, and I just thought it would be interesting to go west. And in those days, like Disneyland was the holy grail for kids. At a TV show, and you're eager to go to Disneyland, but we never did. So I had the chance, working on a different research project, to spend a couple of weeks in the Bay Area the summer between college and law school, and I was interested in it. And eventually worked for part of a summer for a law firm in San Francisco when I was in law school, but applied to judges on the Ninth Circuit for clerkships. No. In those days, you couldn't apply to as many as 100 judges or more as people do today. In my case, the professor I was closest to in law school viewed himself, like I suspect most professors at Yale did, as being essentially a peer of federal judges, and they weren't interested in sending photocopies, but that meant their secretaries had to type letters of recommendation over and over again, and they wouldn't type very many. And so I was told to have a fairly limited number of letters of recommendation, so you had to be selective. So this part is vague, but I think I'm sure I applied to 5 judges on the Ninth Circuit who word of mouth said were supposed to be good to work for. And I'm pretty sure I applied to one judge on the Fifth Circuit who somebody I'd worked with was close to and greatly admired. I may have made another application, I don't recall it, but if so, there weren't very many. It was mostly the Ninth Circuit because it was in the West, and I'd never been in the West. And that summer, when I spent part of the time in San Francisco before my last year of law school, those days the judges would all come to San Francisco. And so I interviewed with judges there. First judge who offered me a job was Herbert Choi from Hawaii. I'd never been in Hawaii before, but I say that I'm such a patriot and public-spirited citizen, I was willing to serve my country on the front lines, so to speak, right? So I agreed to go, even though I never set foot there until I actually arrived for the job a year later. And my 3rd year in law school, I used to watch Hawaii Five-0, the original, on a little black and white TV set, just because it would show Honolulu as having streets and cars and buildings, and not just like the picture postcards.
That's pretty cool.
So that's, and it's obviously changed my whole life. If he doesn't offer me a job, I don't go to Hawaii to become a law clerk. I don't stay in Hawaii to practice law. I don't become a Ninth Circuit judge. You can take a turn sometimes for reasons you don't understand at the time, and that turn turns out to drive everything that happens after that.
And it works out.
In my case, it worked out. And you think sometimes of what if you'd taken a different path, and you might have been run over by a bus. Life is that way. And you do what you can to put yourself in a position to take advantage of opportunities, but you also recognize that luck has an enormous amount to do with it. In my case, I was lucky enough to be offered a job by him. I was smart enough to take it, and the rest is my history.
So you're an adventurer at heart, obviously.
I am, although I realize I got a different strain. My father told me years later that he wanted to go to law school. And this was after I'd gone off to law school myself.
Yeah.
And in his case, he had been in World War II, been in Europe. He came back. He went to college in the GI Bill. Was working for a while to save money to go to law school. Met my mother. They got married. I showed up, and that was the end of law school.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a strain in there, and yet he wound up working, and he was, I thought, pretty adventuresome, but he wound up working for the same company for 40 years.
Yeah, well.
And so there's that streak in me too that I recognize, but at least the wild side won out when I headed off to Honolulu.
Well, when you're first having your job as the clerk for a circuit judge, must have been quite a learning experience, to put it lightly, I would think.
Oh, it was enormous. And there are so many cases in areas of the law that I knew nothing about. And it wasn't just because I might not have had a course in that field. Even if you have a course in that field, it's never detailed to the same level that the cases are. Law school teaches you process. It doesn't teach you to practice law. And so suddenly I'm in a position of writing memos and making recommendations and internally pretending that I'm the judge, because all law clerks know that they're really the brains behind the operation, right? I can tell my own law clerks now that I know what you're thinking. You just can't say it out loud. And so it was challenging, but engaging. And so I wind up working on cases in areas that I didn't know very much about, and did my best not to screw it up too badly in the process of making recommendations to the judge, taking some solace in knowing that he ultimately made the decision, not me, and he would straighten it out if it need be. And recall one case we worked on substantially, antitrust case, and I'd never even taken antitrust in law school. The person who taught it at Yale, who I'd had other classes from and planned to take it from my third year, was Robert Bork, who went on to have greater fame. He was appointed Solicitor General, so he wound up leaving the law school, and I didn't take antitrust as a result because I was less interested in taking it from the person who was teaching it instead. So here I am working on a substantial antitrust case having to do with foreign commerce. And Judge Choi had done some antitrust work, but that wasn't a big part of his practice. So we're feeling our way through. We took some solace knowing that Judge Browning was on the panel, and he did know antitrust law, so if we went too far off track, he'd fix it. So I spent a lot of time learning about that, and then ultimately drafting an opinion for Judge Choi's review and changing and so forth. I realized that, gee, I could do things that I didn't know that I could do, which is what really law school is trying to train people to be capable of doing things by applying the legal reasoning process.
Well, as you said, one of the differences is that in your law clerk, you're dealing with real people, and it's making a difference. It's not theoretical anymore.
And it turns out that's true even, you think of their corporate practice in parties. I mean, criminal cases, immigration cases, it's easy. That person stays in jail. This person, in theory at least, gets deported. Corporate cases, it turns out there are people within those companies who are greatly affected by what you do. So no matter what kind of case it is, there's somebody whose life is going to be substantially affected. So you wind up learning to take it seriously, even if I'm not very good at taking myself seriously. The work is important. And as a law clerk, that struck me, that it wasn't an exercise. It was something that would affect people's lives.
Yeah. So what was the next step?
I'd always assumed I'd go back east, probably to Chicago, possibly Washington, D.C. If I'd been asked, and I frequently ask applicants for law clerk positions, what they see themselves doing. I used to say 20 or 25 years, but to a 25-year-old, that's just too far, so I've shortened the period. And I tell them that I would have been way off the mark in my own, because if I'd been asked, I would have said either I was back in Chicago, probably in private practice, or possibly in Washington, D.C., working for the Department of Justice or something like that. And the judge had never had a clerk stay in Honolulu after the clerkship, although the following year, somebody who'd been a clerk before me came back. I was his 5th year on the court. In those days, judges had 2 law clerks, so I happened to be law clerk number 10. And I was fascinated by the culture in Hawaii. I took a course at the University of Hawaii in Hawaiian history. I joined the Bishop Museum. I came to appreciate the climate is great, the physical beauty is unsurpassed, and so forth. But I really came to appreciate how people related to each other. I mean, the Aloha Spirit's not just an advertising slogan. There's a real generosity there and an openness, and things happened in the course of the year. And I guess it helped. I worked in the courthouse. Most people who were there are a lot of young people there in transient positions working in the visitor industry and so forth, but I'm meeting with people that are actually living there, a very stable kind of life, even though I was passing through for a year. And the openness and generosity of those people toward another mainland haole who's going to pass through for a year, I thought was remarkable. So I decided to stay for a short time. I expected it would be no more than another year or two, but there were hiking trails that hadn't gone on yet, and I liked the guys I was playing pickup basketball with and just feeling comfortable, and I felt young because I'd gone straight through, and at that point I decided, well, here's where I can take my year or two off the path. I'll stick in Hawaii for a while. And Judge Choi and Judge Sam King, who I'd gotten to know pretty well because our offices were next to each other, and he was always interested in having somebody from Yale in the buildings. He was a double Yaley. I was only one, but I qualified, and so I talked to both of them and to the other judges in the courthouse who I'd gotten to know about practice there. And they were pretty specific in telling me who I could go to work for, because they said law school doesn't teach you to practice law. You need to go to work with somebody who will be a good mentor, role model. I doubt if they used those terms, but somebody you'd learn good practice habits from. And they were pretty explicit in saying that excluded the public agencies. I mean, Judge Choi had been Attorney General of the territory. A lot of respect for some people in the office, not so much for some others, but he said they're not set up to teach people how to be a lawyer. You'd show up in the office, they'd hand you a file, and then you'd try to figure it out. And maybe you'd be lucky enough to work next to somebody who could give you a good role model. But he and Judge King urged me to go to work for, and then they named some names. And when I decided toward the end of the clerkship to stay for a while, I contacted some of those people and wound up joining a law firm then called Cage, Shuddy, Fleming and Wright, which I thought I'd probably be at for a couple of years before going back. I wound up, it was there for 25. I liked the people and I liked the work I was doing, and the longer I stayed in Honolulu, the more comfortable I got. There were a couple times along the way in the first few years I thought seriously about moving back to the mainland, but in the end it wasn't what I wanted to do.
And that law firm is still viable.
Law firm's still there. They, like most law firms, have shortened their name since, so it's now Cage, Shuddy, LLC maybe. I don't know. It's diagonally across the street from where my office is. I get occasionally, they're still on my recusal list. Susan Mulway, who was a district judge in Honolulu, who just stepped down as chief judge last year, was one of my partners there, and when she left the firm, she had to sever the connection pretty sharply because District of Hawaii, that firm had a pretty substantial number of the complicated civil cases that you don't want to be able to work on as a judge, but the fraction of cases in the Ninth Circuit that the firm's involved in is a small part of 1%. So I still get invited to firm functions, and I've some, of course, close friends who are still there, and realize time passes, and increasingly I see people in the hallway, who are these people? And they're looking at me, who's that? So it happens, but no, it's still there and doing very well.
And my experience with trying cases in Hawaii is that the Aloha spirit even permeates the court.
There are things that people don't do. I mean, I was fortunate enough to work some on complicated multi-district litigation, or many cases where at least some parties are represented by lawyers from California or even New York and Chicago. And it's not black and white, but in the world of shades of gray, things are a lot lighter in Honolulu than they are elsewhere. And
Yeah.
part of it, I think, is that the people that decide to live in Hawaii are self-selected. If you're the most driving, aggressive type, then this is probably not the community for
Yeah.
you. And part of it is that even if by nature you'd be prepared to, what do I say, deal from the bottom of the deck, it's a small enough community that
That's
it's
right.
going to be known real fast.
Real fast.
I mean, when I started, it wasn't quite the case that everybody knew everybody else, but everybody knew somebody who knew the other person. And there may be another degree of separation today, but the word gets around pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
it's still pretty tight.
And so it's a good way to practice.
Yeah.
I mean, you take the work seriously, work long hours when you needed to, but it wasn't all that there was to life, and you play things straight. If somebody else had a problem, you try to solve the problem rather than make his life miserable.
Yeah. So after your 25 years of law practice, how did your appointment process go?
It really started in 1991 when there was a vacancy on the district court. Now, when you're a law clerk, you dream about being the judge, but it had become a pretty low priority to me. Indeed, if I wanted to become a judge, Hawaii was an unlikely place for me to be appointed. Among other things, we have no ethnic majority, but politicians in Hawaii, like elsewhere, are conscious of ethnic background. And I recall when I went through the process myself 10 years later, the assistant